So, one of the things that we always do, and since it is January 2nd, this day stands out in my mind and in my life in so many different ways. And the most significant way that this day stands out is the Tory Acts by Continental Congress. And that's because the second Tory Act, which was the largest of the Tory Acts, was basically promulgated. And it happened to be promulgated on January 2nd, 1776. Now, we already kind of understand the history that the colonies were basically colonies of England. It was English rule, the monarchy, and we were subjects to that monarch. And that the monarch kind of established this ruse thing called this republican form of governing, the parliament, where the parliament actually represented the people. It was a democratic parliament. There were two classes of people that were represented. There were the people themselves were represented in the House of Commons. And then the aristocrats, the bankers, those who had the influence within the land of England or within Britain, they were given the representation in the House of Lords. And therefore, we can see how, there was obviously a disadvantage between the two houses. And so as they started using the Stamp Acts, as they started using tyranny and basically putting the burden of the debts of Britain upon the colonies, we were pretty rich out here. They said, we're going to put the burdens on them. And I hope you understand, one of the things that most people lose sight of is the burden of the tax on the Stamp Acts. If I remember correctly, the tax on that tea was 1/10 of a cent. And at that point in time, it was completely repugnant and unacceptable to those who were involved in the Tea Party. And those who were involved in the initial resistance, the Sons of Liberty and so forth, I mean, they were responding to this form of taxation that they didn't have to deal with for a long, long time. It's very similar to the territories under the U.S. government. Territories weren't subject to tax. They had to become a state. This is why the design, and most people didn't even understand this, Madison didn't even understand this, that it became a driving factor. It became a motivator for the federal government to actually form more states. What would have happened if, let's take the Dakotas, let's take, Minnesota, let's take Montana, let's take a big swath of the plains, not the mountains, but just the plains right there from Montana all the way down to Kansas, this big, huge swath of plains. Let's say that became one state. Well, shoot. I mean, the federal government actually made more money and had a better advantage by having more states than they did on having, one big state. Because as more states joined the Union, and the faster they could get to that point, so making them smaller made more sense because then they could get the needed population in that smaller area. So when we look at the motivation in growing the republic, the drive for Manifest Destiny, part of that manipulation was to help grow the revenue of the federal government. Because once a state became a state, it received apportionment, and what went hand in hand with apportionment was taxation. Oh, now that you're a state and now that you have actual representation, that voting representation in Congress, we can now tax you. See, there's a reason for all of this. But that was something that was baked into the Constitution that kept the federal government from actually doing things. But it didn't take long for them to start realizing, oh, well, if we withhold stuff. So anyway, I'm going down a rat hole on, some history, and we'll get into the Manifest Destiny. We'll get into the Enabling Acts. We got a whole year ahead of us. But today, right now, the framework we're really looking at is the monarchical government that existed. And under the monarchical framework, we had jural assemblies. We had the ability as citizens, as Englishmen, to call and create a common law grand jury. And we could go to the sheriff and actually get the, and create a common law grand jury to actually petition the king. So in many ways, at this point in time, throughout the colonies, there were many different efforts that were organizing and forming to petition the king. We already know that in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson referenced this, right? And so when we get to the Declaration of Independence, I will actually prove this. But all you got to do is search for the word petition. It was there after repeated petition. They turned a deaf ear to us. In other words, they were denying us this inalienable right that was guaranteed by the Magna Carta and the glorious Bill of Rights. They're denying that same right under the Constitution. And when our local government refuses to hear our petitions, we need to replace them with those who will actually stand up and support our petitions and forward them, endorse them, and become our champions of the Constitution. This is what we need in our local counties today. Now, in 1775, October 6th, after Continental Congress kind of formed and George Washington was kind of getting organized to go up into Massachusetts, and I think he was probably already up there by October 6th. But looking at the lay of the land, this is what Continental Congress sent out. And they actually identify who they're sending this out to. It says resolved. This is Continental Congress, October 6, 1775. Resolved that it be recommended to the several provincial assemblies or conventions and councils or committees of safety. Now, it's interesting how clearly they identified assemblies, they identified conventions, they basically identified councils. The last thing that they identified was these committees of safety. In other words, that was the smallest group. But these were basically involved citizens seeking, their rights as Englishmen to redress their grievances. And so he says, it states that these local assemblies, conventions, councils, or committees of safety, and this is what they're calling upon them to do, to arrest and secure every person in their respective colonies who's going at large, in their opinion, endanger the safety of the colony or the liberties of America. So the very first thing the Continental Congress basically did was they sent out this bench warrant on any and all people who were, going at large, in their opinion, endangering the safety of the colony and or the liberties of America. In other words, those who were British loyalists, they wanted to arrest. Now, think about this. The Continental Congress kind of formed through it wasn't a full movement. I want you to understand that there wasn't a statewide election. As a matter of fact, at this point in time, the king had seized control of the colonies. There wasn't a colony-wide election to create these representatives. They actually did this kind of in secret. This became a secret government. Had they actually, right in the face of, these representatives of the British Crown say, oh, okay, we're having these elections and these are going to be our representatives, they would have had these guys arrested and hanged just like that. They knew what they were doing was not going to be embraced by the provincial, or I should say, these puppet governments that the king had created. So why were they so emboldened to think, oh, well, we can arrest these folks? Because they thought that they had the numbers. Well, what ended up happening was that they were communicated back to Continental Congress from these committees, from these provincial organizations, these local organizations, and said, hey, do you realize what you're asking us to do? You know, you're just putting us in jeopardy. You know, do you want us to just basically go and tell the government, you know, where you guys are so that they can just come and arrest you instead? They said, hey, come on, we got to have a little secrecy here. You know, the only thing that was really clear was George Washington and his what we'll call the Continental militiamen. But actually, it wasn't really an army. It was just the local people it wasn't the full Continental. It was the militia that had been organized from, Massachusetts, and I don't know what other states maybe. But from that area, they organized, they brought their militia together, and this is where they started bringing resources from these other colonies. If I remember correctly, a part of that battle before this, July, or I should say before that 1776, escape out of Massachusetts, if I remember correctly, they had, these artillery brought down from Saratoga I forget the gentleman, David McCullough, I believe, is the one that did 1776. Really good history on this. But if you really look at what was going on, the only thing that was really evident to Britain was that the colonies had kind of created this militia or segments of the colony and colonies, neighboring colonies, kind of pulled together and says, we're going to repel you. We're going to fight you. And so that was the only thing that was obvious. The fact that there was a Continental Congress somewhere down in Philadelphia or wherever they were at that point in time didn't matter because it was kind of secret. So Continental Congress, after this first request to arrest these folks, came back in January 2nd, just a few months later, 1776, and this is why we're reading it today. And this is what they said. Whereas it has been represented to this Congress that divers, honest, and well-meaning but uninformed people in these colonies have, by the art and address of minstrel agents, been deceived and drawn into erroneous opinions respecting the American cause and the probable issue of the present contest. And then it goes, resolved that it be recommended to the different committees. Now, at this point, they just kind of simplify it by the committees and other friends to American liberty in the said colonies to treat all such persons with kindness and attention, to consider them as the inhabitants of a country determined to be free, and to view their errors as proceeding rather from want of information than want of virtue or public spirit, to explain to them the origin, nature, and extent of the present controversy, to acquaint them with the fate of the numerous petitions presented to the Majesty, as well as by assemblies as by congresses, for reconciliation and redress of grievances. Right there, folks, right there. Petitions and redresses of grievances. When you're living under tyranny, this is what we do, and this is what we actually have protected by the law of the land. And that the last from this Congress, humbly requesting the single favor of being heard, like all the others, has proved unsuccessful, to unfold them the various arts of administration to ensnare and enslave us, and the manner in which we have been cruelly driven to defend by arms those very rights, liberties, and estates which we and our forefathers had long enjoyed unmolested in the reigns of his present Majesty's predecessors. And it is hereby recommended to all conventions and assemblies, and we want to highlight that, is, it's not just committees, assemblies and conventions in these colonies, liberally to distribute among the people the proceedings of this and the former Congress, the late speeches of the great patriots in both houses of Parliament relative to American grievances, and such other pamphlets and papers as tend to elucidate or to help clarify the merits of the American cause. The Congress being fully persuaded, the more our right to the enjoyment of our ancient liberties and privileges is examined, the more unjust and necessary our present opposition to minstrel tyranny will be. And with respect to all such unworthy Americans, as regardless of their duty to their Creator, their country, and prosperity, have taken part with our oppressors and influenced by the hope or possession of ignominious rewards, strive to recommend themselves to the bounty of administration by misrepresenting and traducing, T-A-R-D-U-C-I-N-G, in other words, criticizing. I would never have used that word, but that's an archaic way of doing it. The conduct and principles of the Friends of American Liberty and opposing every measure formed for its preservation and security. Now, as they're going through this, they're obviously really selling this whole point that, you know, we have these rights and we demand that these rights be heard. At this point, folks, they still hadn't had the Declaration of Independence. They had been pleading and saying, you can't do this. We have rights. You're taxing us. We have a right of representation. We have a right to be within the body of Parliament, both in both houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Resolved that it be, as a matter of fact, where would George Washington have fallen if all of a sudden Britain had changed their tune and they opened up members of the colonies to enter into both houses? Well, I think Washington, because he was the prominent military man in the colonies at the time, I think Washington probably would have went into the House of Lords. Now, he did have predilections, you know, throughout his, you know, moving towards the Constitution of being an aristocrat because of his seeking the involvement in the Society of the Cincinnati. And so, you know, that was their paradigm. I'm just here telling you, folks, that when you really look at their paradigm, their whole world had, you know, been generations and generations and generations of living under the Magna Carta and this monarchical rule. So when they started actually fighting against the monarch and their fundamental rights, they weren't looking to really create something new. They were just demanding their rights. So they maintained this functioning. It's kind of like when you look at what Martin Luther did, he didn't change. They didn't reform Christianity with his theses. They realized that the only way they could actually, you know, be more compliant to the scriptures was to reform Christianity to do so. They were hoping that the Catholic Church would have reformed, but they didn't. So nevertheless, moving forward, the next resolved that it be recommended to the different assemblies, conventions, and committees or councils of safety, now it's councils of safety, in the United Colonies, by the most speedy and effectual measures to frustrate the mischievous machinations and restrain the wicked practices of these men. And it is the opinion of this Congress that they ought to be disarmed, and the more dangerous among them either kept in safe custody or bound with sufficient sureties to their good behavior. And in order that the said assemblies, conventions, committees, or councils of safety may be enabled with greater ease and facility to carry this resolution into execution. Now, I'm going to take a quick aside here. Think about this, folks, because we got less than a minute left before the break. Think about this. You know, here we are actually, you know, trying to feud or trying to demand what is we believe is rightfully ours within a system and government that we're really not trying to topple at this point in time. But what we want is we want to be heard. We want our voices to actually be heard so that we can enjoy the rights of an Englishman. Doggone it, we have these rights and we demand them. And so they're trying to get the rest of these folks, and the rest of these folks are actually happy. The majority, there were lots of Americans that were happy to just go along up to this point, and they didn't see what the ruckus was all about until the war really started raging forward. And it's still, the war still wasn't highly supported, but what they ended up doing was they started taking note by these Tory acts of who the real British loyalists were and who those people that harmed them. Because what ended up coming around the corner, was the actual comeuppings that actually caused the second iteration of the revolution.